Welcome to church. Thanks so much for being here on the long weekend. Thankful that you decided to spend it with us. You were really worried about that. You thought it was coming right at you. You're fine. We're good here. Growing up, my mom used to tell me things. And as a little child, when your mom tells you things, you take those things as facts, right? They're truth, right? You take the things that your mom tells you as facts. At least you're supposed to. If you're under 12 here, you're supposed to. But as you get older, you realize that sometimes the things your mother tells you are not always true. Like if I ate that apple and the apple seed I ate that, there wouldn't be necessarily a tree would grow up in my stomach. That's what my mom would tell me. And for the longest time, I never ate too much of an apple because I was afraid I was going to have an apple tree growing in my stomach and different things like that, right? As we grow up, we learn sometimes the things that are common or things that have been said to us are not necessarily true. But I've realized that there's a lot of things that have been said or people say or common sentiments that are exchanged around us that we take as truth, but actually they've proven not to be. I'm going to give you a couple. Hopefully this won't, shatter the paradigm in which you live. But when someone's cracking their knuckles, you know that person, right? We all know that person. They have to crack every knuckle, and then what we say to that is like, you crack your knuckles, that's you're going to get arthritis. That's how you get arthritis, early signs of arthritis. It's actually not true. Doctors have come out repeatedly say that's not actually, there's no scientific proof that cracking knuckles actually leads to arthritis. I think someone did come up with it because it's quite annoying, and I'm going to keep saying that one, but it's not true. And then, there's the other one that they say, if you swallow gum, that gum will live in your stomach for 7 years before your body can digest it, right? We've all heard that one. We've maybe told our children that one. That's actually, it's not 7 years, it's more like hours, or at the most a couple days, because your body can actually digest it, so it just passes it through its system, right? Or the one that I remember in school, that you can see the wall of China in space. You can see it from space. NASA has repeatedly said you cannot see the wall of China from space. Even so, though, textbooks aren't catching up with that, and even today, textbooks still write in their textbooks that you can see the wall of China from space. I could go on, but I don't want to shatter too many of your paradigms, like you swallow 6 spiders on average a year. It's not true. Your nails continue to grow after you die. These are all things, these are common sentiments that we share among one another, but have proven to be false, that aren't reality. I say all that because we're looking at this series called The Spectator's Look at Jesus. And the conversation of Jesus, especially here in Metro Vancouver, is that does Jesus fit within that same category? In other words, many individuals think that Jesus is one of those things that we believed for a season and that we followed for a while, but now that we know more, that Jesus actually never really existed, and that the idea of Jesus is just simply a fable that has been created and now spun off, and churches gather around that idea. It's gaining in popularity, especially here in Vancouver and other places along Canada. The idea that Jesus is simply a manufactured idea. It comes from this idea that the idea of Jesus was just borrowed from myths and different ancient thoughts of the day, and that idea of Jesus was created that a few individuals wanted to start a new religion, so they created the idea of Jesus, and then it snowballed from there. And now what we have is just simply that was something that was constructed and manufactured and something that's not reality. In fact, the author Tom Harper wrote a book in 2004 called The Pagan Christ. And the whole idea of his book, that the idea of Jesus was just simply this idea that was borrowed from common myths of the day and was simply constructed and manufactured. And his book in 2004 was one of the top-selling nonfiction books in Canada. Lots of people read that. CBC actually liked it so much they did a documentary about it, right? So did Jesus really exist? It's the question today. It's a question that we're going to wrestle with, because as we look at the spectator view of Jesus, as we look at the different aspects of who Jesus is, we need to ask that question: did Jesus really exist? Or to say another way, we're going to look at Jesus as a historical person. And I know, it's Thanksgiving weekend. And, if I'm going to be honest, we planned this series out weeks ago, and the last couple of weeks, I knew this subject was coming up as Jesus as a historical person, and I said to Amy, I'm like, let's just skip it. let's just move it. Let's get to like who Jesus attracted, or Jesus as a healer, or one of these other subjects. It's like, it's pretty technical. There's a lot of information. It's Thanksgiving Sunday. People need a break, I didn't really want to jump into this. But I'm continually surprised at the conversations I have with people. Because I'm a pastor, the conversation of Jesus comes up pretty quick in conversations. But I'm overly surprised about how many times I talk with people, and it's not that they have a different view of Jesus. They're not even sure if Jesus is a reality. We're not even sure if Jesus even existed in the first place. And so I wanted to talk about this subject today because this is perhaps what your neighbor thinks about Jesus, or your family member, your coworker, or maybe even yourself. You have some hesitations around the historicity of Jesus. This is especially true of Generation Z, roughly 18 to 30-year-olds. 76% of Generation Z actually think that Christianity isn't true. It's not true. And in fact, after suffering and hypocrisy, the third biggest doubt for Generation Z, a quarter of them think that it's not historically true. That's their greatest doubt with Christianity, that they don't think it's historically accurate. 40%, almost half of those living in the United Kingdom, believe that Jesus was a myth or never even existed in the first place. Almost half of the United Kingdom. So the conversation as Jesus as a historical person is one that we have to have a conversation about, because we can't simply talk about the other aspects of Jesus. We can't simply talk about Jesus as a prophet and a healer, Jesus, who he attracted, what he said, what kind of person he was, if at the very back of your mind is a doubt whether Jesus existed in the first place. Or this is the foundation that we need to build on in the conversation of Jesus as a historical person. So that's our goal today, is we're going to look at the historicity, or Jesus as a historical person. And to do that, probably the best place for us to start is, again, looking back at the historian that wrote about and created the biography of Jesus' life. His name was Luke. He was a doctor. He wrote one of the 4 independent biographies of Jesus' life. And so we're going to go there, Luke chapter 2, verses 1. It's going to be up on the screen momentarily, but as you make your way there, just some context. So again, Luke's a historian. And so he creates a historical account of Jesus, and in that's the history that we have of who Jesus was. And so we're going to read some of that together, and I think it's going to help paint a picture of who Jesus was. This is what Luke says in chapter 2, verses 1. In those days, so again, Luke is giving the synopsis of how Jesus entered the world, the birth story of Jesus. All the biographers do this, but Luke gives the details of how the story of Jesus entered history. In those days, Caesar Augustus, who was the emperor of Rome at that point, issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to their own town to register. So Luke says, hey, in the time when Jesus was born, the emperor of the time of Rome created a census, which was a common thing at that point. The Roman emperor would create a census for several different reasons. One, to create taxes, to make sure taxation happened. That's why the government's always wanting to know where you live. Anyway, so taxation. And then secondly, for military services. They need to know who's out there, who's able, who's fit, if they have to go to war, who they can lean on. And third, to remind you who your allegiance is. So censuses would actually be very common in the ancient world, and the Roman governor, or Roman emperor at that point, set one out. But do you see how Luke starts his story of Jesus? He writes the story of Jesus and he says, listen, the God in which I'm speaking about entered history. God entered history. Do you see how Luke begins his story? Did you see it? Once upon a time. No, it didn't say that. In a galaxy far... No, it didn't say that either. This prophet had this dream or this epiphany. No, it didn't say that. He said, in the days of Caesar Augustus, in the time that Quirinius was governor over Syria, everybody went back to their home. In other words, he puts the story of Luke puts the story of Jesus right into history. He says this is a historical reality. In other words, it is now subject and to the scrutiny of the investigation of history, which is unique about the story of Jesus. It's unique. Other religions don't have their stories or their sacred texts in history like the New Testament has its story of Jesus in history. Other cults don't have these things. They simply have revelations and different things like that. But Luke is saying an important thing for us to understand for today. Luke is saying that the story of Jesus is based in history. In other words, Luke is saying this is a historical event. This is not just simply a way of life. This is not simply just a good life or some revelation. This is not simply just a way of how we should, figure out how life and happiness is found. He's saying, no, this is an actual historical event that happened, which changes history. And then at the same time puts itself under scrutiny of history. Now, I use this passage of Scripture because, one, I think it communicates a historical reality that Jesus was born during a certain time and place. But I also use this one because we have some problems with these verses here. In fact, Richard Dawkins, who wrote, he's a prolific atheist. He wrote, probably most famous, the book The God Delusion. He sold millions of copies in it. In the premise of his book, he gives you his hope for why you read it. He says, I hope you read this book as a believer, and when you're done, you are an unbeliever. That's what I'm hoping for. So he wanted to convert you. That was his point in writing the book, right? So in it, he attacks Christianity, and when he gets to the Bible, he takes it apart in different ways, but when he talks about the historical accuracy of the Bible, he quotes this verse. Why? Because we have some date issues here, and I actually want us to talk about them because I want us to talk to the reality of what we're speaking to. So the issues around timeline. See, Luke and the other biographers put Jesus' birth around the time of Herod the Great. We know that Herod the Great died roughly around 4 BC. Some say about 1 BC, but probably around 4 BC. But then he says this, he has this verse 2, in brackets. You saw that? He says, in the time that Quirinius was governor of Syria. We know when Quirinius was governor of Syria, and Quirinius did this census in 6 AD. So here's the problem, is that the biographers say that Jesus was born during the time of Herod the Great, which was in 4 BC, and Quirinius was governor of Syria at 6 AD. We have a 10-year gap here. And so atheists and different people that are critical of the story of Jesus and say, they draw circles around this verse and say, Jesus was just simply fabricated up. He was just simply made up. The idea of Jesus actually doesn't have any historical truth to it. And that's why I want to talk about this verse specifically, because this is what you may be in conversation with people. This is the verse they'd circle around and say, listen, you can believe you're Jesus, but Jesus isn't a historical person. It might be true for you, but it didn't happen in history. Scholars are not amiss by this. Scholars have been aware of this for a long time, and there's been conversation, debate around this, but there's a couple really good solutions for this. The first one is that Quirinius was potentially a governor of this area of Galilee twice. In fact, in the 1700s, they found an inscription where there was a governor that was listed. The name wasn't on it, but an inscription, but the governor was listed of serving twice in this area. Many scholars believe that was Quirinius. We know by other records that Quirinius was in the area as a military leader, which would have the same authority as a governor at that time, at the time of Herod the Great. So we have historical reality that he was there at that point. But we have also a second solution. When you see, and it says the first census that was given, and verse 2, this was the first census that took place. Even maybe in your Bibles, you might see it as a footnote that in the original language, in Koinonia Greek, that word first might actually mean before. In some places it shows up before, which then would make sense with our timeline, where Luke says this sense, or the birth of Jesus happened before Quirinius was governor of Syria. There's a couple of solutions there. But the reason why I talk about this verse specifically is because these are the type of conversations that people would have. That they would say that we just sing about Jesus, but Jesus is void from historical reality, which Luke doesn't give us that permission. This actually reminds me of the story in John 5 of Bethesda, the pool. There's this interesting story in John 5 when Jesus goes and he heals this paralytic right at the entrance of at the temple in Jerusalem. And what's interesting about John's account of this story is nowhere else in history do we have record of these pools. meaning John is the only person in history to record of these pools at the temple gates in Jerusalem. So in the early 20th century, late 19th century, they go and they dig up around this area, and they could only find one pool. John talks about 2 pools with these 5 colonnades, which would be these columns with roofs. He's very specific. They dig it up, they don't find anything. They find one pool, it's not like the description that John is, and then for 100 years, university professors, different people would say, listen, the story of Jesus is not historically accurate. Look, John, he's literally making up stories. He's making up these areas that don't even exist. 100 years after they first dug, they dug a little bit deeper. You know what they found? 2 pools with 5 colonnades around them, a unique thing that only John has ever recorded were there. No one knew about it except for John in his account when Jesus went and healed a paralytic. So for 100 years, people were like, the story of Jesus is not true because of John 5. And professors at universities say, listen, you can believe in your Jesus, but it's not historically accurate. And Luke says, no, I'm going to put the story of Jesus right into history. So 3 things that we know. I want to close with 3 things we know based on this idea of Jesus as a historical person. If you stay with me for these last 3, there's pie for you at the end. 3 things we know. Number 1, I've alluded to it, but I want to speak to it. Jesus was a historical person. Jesus was a historical person. Because you know the idea that Jesus never existed is only a recent phenomenon, the last 200 years. Before that, no one ever doubted the existence of Jesus, but in the last 200 years, there has been a challenge around Jesus' existence. But interesting is that we know more about Jesus than any of his historical contemporaries. We know more about Jesus than Herod the Great. We know more about Jesus than Caesar Augustus, an emperor of the most powerful nation at the time. We know more about Jesus. It's actually quite surprising and uncommon that we have 4 independent biographies of Jesus' life. Independent meaning they wrote their accounts of Jesus without interaction with each other. See, this was the time before someone did something half impressive and they wrote their autobiography and everyone else writes a biography with them, on the front of the book like that, right? People didn't write accounts about people unless there was something that was significant. We have 4. We actually have more accurate information about Jesus than we do about Alexander the Great. Our biographies of Jesus are a lot closer and a lot more accurate than the ones about Alexander the Great, but no one is debating that Alexander the Great was a real historical person. Why? Because we've seen the effects of Hellenism and Greek culture and how it's influenced so many other places, and you think that maybe Christianity had some influence as well. E.P. Sanders is historical, he writes about the history of Jesus. He's probably one of the big history heavyweights of the 20th century. He's one of the most respectful historians about Jesus. And he talks about the history of Jesus, and he says, undoubtedly and undeniably, we know these things about Jesus. We know these things. History told us. 1, that Jesus was born roughly around 4 BC, which we talked about. 2nd, he spent his childhood and early adult years in Nazareth. He was baptized by John the Baptist. He taught in towns and villages in Galilee. He was arrested and interrogated by Jewish officials. He was executed on the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate, and he goes on and lists some other details. But E.P. Sanders says, we know these things as historically true. In other words, what we have in the Gospels has proven time and time again to be historically accurate. Bart Ehrmann is an agnostic who got so tired of this new idea, this myth about Jesus never existing and not even sure if he was a real person. Bart Ehrmann got so tired of hearing about this as a scholar. As an agnostic, he wrote a book, Did Jesus Really Exist? This is what he says in it, quote, the idea that Jesus did not exist is a modern notion. It has no ancient precedence. It was made up in the 18th century. One might as well call it a modern myth, the myth of the mythical Jesus. Bart Ehrmann goes on to say, there is no serious scholar would deny the historical existence of Jesus. In fact, you could go to Wikipedia and you could look up Jesus and the myth of Jesus, and Wikipedia would tell you the same thing. I say all this, though, because the idea of Jesus not being a real person or never even existed is common in the conversations that we have with people. And although many people would rather say that Jesus never existed and was simply fabricated, the evidence won't allow us to have that position. Now, historians might agree on Jesus' historical reality, but they might disagree on his deity. Amy gave a great talk a couple weeks ago outlining that. So 3 things we know. 1, Jesus was a historical person. Number 2, the story of Jesus, no story has been more scrutinized. Now, I want to make a caveat here. I'm not making a claim or a case for I'm not speaking to the Bible's legitimacy or the validity of the Bible here. That's honestly another conversation, probably a series of conversations. I'm just speaking to the reality of the stories of Jesus and what we find in the 4 biographical accounts of him in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In other words, I'm speaking to the validity and the accuracy of the story of Jesus in which we have in the Gospels. There has been no story, ancient or modern, that has received more scrutiny, has been looked at, has the evidence been examined, has been tested more than the story of Jesus. In fact, in the last 200 years, we have a lot more new tools to help us examine Jesus. We have archaeology, which we spoke to earlier, that shows the stories of Jesus and the historical realities of him. And we have new language tools. We have new parchments and new original language things coming in. We have more and more new tools and more new evidence that just continue to show us that the story of Jesus remains true. J.B. Phillips was Anglican in England in the 20th century, and he set out a course to write the New Testament in the language of the modern day. And so he created a new translation to help understand the stories of Jesus, and he spent decades to do this. And after he spent time, this is one of his observations. He says this, quote, "I have read in Greek and Latin scores of myths, but I did not find the slightest flavor of myth here," speaking about the Gospels. "No man could have set down such artless and vulnerable accounts as these unless some real event lay behind them." In other words, J.B. Phillips is saying, listen, the story of Jesus is too incredible, it's too vulnerable, it's too artless for anybody to simply manufacture, fabricate these ideas. It would not make sense. My best verdict is that this story is true. Jesus was a historical person. No story has been more scrutinized. And number 3, finally, history matters. History matters. Some of you are like, I thought I left history class in grade 9. I didn't think I was going back to it. Some of you, at risk of sounding as one of your elders to tell you that history matters, I think we need to take a moment and look back at the story of Jesus and remind ourselves that history matters. Because some of you are like, why can't I just have a relationship with Jesus? Why can't we just sing about Jesus? Why do we have to get all down the nitty-gritty into the weeds about the historical reality of Jesus? Like, can't we just save that for something else? Why do we have to have these conversations, Jordan, right? Let's just eat pie and sing about Jesus and talk about it. Why do we need to talk about the historical reality of Jesus? Well, N.T. Wright, arguably the greatest theologian of our time, says this: when we abandon history, the brakes are off and the portrait slides away into fantasy. In other words, N.T. Wright's saying, hey, when we give up on history, when we abandon it, the idea of Jesus just simply slides away into fantasy. The brakes are off. In other words, we simply make Jesus in our own image. We simply create the Jesus that we want him to be. But God, in his wisdom, came down to a time and place and lived among a certain type of ethnic people, spoke a certain language, lived in a certain climate, ate certain food. Why? To communicate what kind of God Jesus is and what kind of God of the Old Testament Jesus was. E.P. Sanders goes on, he says, people want to agree with Jesus, and often means they see him as agreeing with themselves. People want to agree with Jesus, which often means they see Jesus agreeing with themselves. See, when Jesus enters into history, Jesus enters as a certain individual. It's the uncovering in history that we discover the true and beautiful Jesus, as Philip Yancey says, the Jesus I never knew. See, it is in the history, it is in the context in which Jesus lived is where the mysteries of God are found. To understand who God is, to understand who Jesus is, we need to understand the world in which Jesus lived, because then his comments to turn the other cheek have a significant weight in that reality. For Jesus to die on a cross, it seems like barbaric and just seems cruel and seems unusual to the modern 21st individual, but it had a lot of significance in the time he lived. See, the Jesus we sing about, the Jesus who we praise, is not just an idea, not just simply a way of life, not just simply a good friend of ours, it's not simply some spiritual individual we have, but it is a person that existed at a historical time. We sing and we worship a historical reality, an event that happened. It changes everything, right? It has huge implications for you and I. I'm inviting the team to come back, and I want to close with a story. My story is one where the story of Jesus intersected at my life at a critical junction. It was probably one of the turning points in my faith. I was 20 years old. I was unemployed. I just came back from Africa. All my friends were at university, and I had nothing going on. And so when you're unemployed and all your friends are gone, what do? Well, you read the Bible, right? So I started reading the Bible like I've never read it before, from like the very front to the very end. And I started having conversations with people, and through that pursuit and through that trying to understand and wrap my head around this, my friend was coming out here to a theological school to BC. I grew up in Nova Scotia. I was like, I'm going to come out too. I'm kind of going to come out not because I want to pursue this as a career. I don't want to do any of that stuff. I just want to learn more about Jesus. Because when Jesus became a reality, came a wave of questions with that. So my first semester here, and my friends that knew me at that time, they could validate the story. I wasn't pursuing a girl. I wasn't trying to get more points in the ball hockey tournament. I wasn't going to 7-Eleven at 11 p.m. with all my friends. I was in the library because I had so many questions. I was in the library, and what became the wave of information that was astounding to me. I thought we knew very little about Jesus. I thought very few people have actually dug and done the work like I was going to do the work. But what I discovered, the Jesus that I explored in the library, was a Jesus that many people have written about, and many people have attested to, and many people have looked at the evidence and looked at the history that he lived and the historical reality of Jesus. And the Jesus I discovered was not just simply a Jesus that was just for those who have a religious preference or grow up a certain way, or the Jesus that I discovered wasn't just those that were simply that grew up in a heritage of faith and just they were following the family lineage. The Jesus I discovered was one that actually entered history and therefore changed the course of history. So I say all of this because I discovered Jesus not through a prayer gathering, not a worship service, not even my quiet time, my devotions. I discovered Jesus through the library and the pursuit of understanding who this person was. So when you tell your neighbor you go to church or you're a follower of Jesus, know that you're just not saying this out of some experience you have, although that's a big part of our faith, but you're also standing on the weight of the historical reality that Jesus existed, lived, walked on this earth. And the best evidence we have continues to prove that time and time and time again. So it has drastic implications to you and I. Because then Jesus is not just simply some spiritual ascent that we go to some spiritual person or just not some thing that we connect with on a spiritual reality, but it has a real reality in our life today. Could you stand with me? And I would love to pray with you as we close. Father, as much as some of us would like to put Jesus as simply a spiritual or mythical person, the evidence doesn't allow us to do that. And so we just take a moment, even in this setting right now. And this morning has been full of information, of facts and figures, and maybe for some of us we got lost in the weeds, but may we be reminded that the reality of Jesus is an implication that affects every one of us. And that, like every week, there's an invitation for each and every one of us to follow you again, afresh. So, Lord, may this not just simply be some head knowledge, may this not just simply be a talk, but may the reality of Jesus walking on this earth, living among us, just have great implications to how we live. And maybe for some of us who have dismissed Jesus, or maybe we have friends or family who have dismissed Jesus just simply because it's just some hyperbole, may we just think again. May we reconsider. So I pray for my brothers and sisters this morning. May the person of Jesus just be so tangible, be so real to each and every one of us today. May we experience Jesus in a new way, a fresh way. So, Father, as we close and as we sing this last song, Holy Spirit, may you speak to us. Jesus, may you minister to us personally, individually. Lord, you know what our weeks have been, our months have been. You know what's the realities going on. So, Jesus, would you speak to us in our time, in our place, right now? Beautiful name. Amen.